Let's begin here, because too many people still confuse being alone with being unloved. A woman who lives without a partner is not always lonely, broken, or bitter. She may simply be full, so full of herself, her peace, her presence, that she no longer needs noise to feel alive. She's not hiding, she's not cold, and she's certainly not waiting for someone to give her value. She walks quietly, but not aimlessly. Her solitude isn't emptiness, it's space, chosen space. And in that space, she has found something the world rarely offers: her own reflection. You won't see her begging. You won't hear her justifying, because she's stopped living for approval and started listening for truth. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, this story isn't about rebellion. It's about return. Not the kind of return that takes you back to old lovers or worn out roles, but the return to self, the quiet reconnection with your soul, the part of you that was never broken, just buried. Many still believe a woman needs to be chosen to matter, that her worth is proven through relationships, through sacrifice, through being needed. But when she no longer bends to be loved, when she no longer molds herself to fit someone else's frame, something ancient awakens. Carl Jung once said, "Those who look outside dream, those who look inside awaken." And the woman who walks alone has done exactly that. She stopped waiting for the world to define her. She turned inward, not to escape, but to remember. She remembered how much she had given, how often she dimmed her own light just to make someone else comfortable. She saw how deeply she had confused love with approval and care with control, and in that recognition, a line was drawn, not in anger, but in awareness, because you reach a point where silence speaks louder than pleading, where presence becomes more valuable than performance, where you no longer ask, "Will someone love me?" but instead, "Can I remain true to myself, even when no one is watching?" That's the beginning, not the end, of hope or romance or connection, but the end of dependency, of distortion, of losing yourself just to be seen. And from that stillness, a new kind of love can emerge. One that doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't shrink. But that comes only after you've stopped fearing your own company. This is where her journey begins. Not with a man, not with heartbreak, but with a question. What if being alone was never a weakness, but a doorway? A doorway to wholeness. And that's where we'll go next. Not every woman who chooses solitude began that way. Before there is strength, there is breaking. And before she ever stood alone with clarity, she stood surrounded yet unseen. She gave. Not because she didn't know her value, but because she hoped someone else would. She softened her edges to be accepted. She stayed quiet to keep the peace. She bent herself into shapes that made others more comfortable and called it love. At first, the cost was invisible. She gave more than she received, but told herself this was patience. She tolerated being misunderstood and told herself this was kindness. But over time, something deeper began to ache. Not the ache of missing someone, the ache of missing herself. Carl Jung wrote that what is not made conscious will be lived as fate. And so many women for years live out the same story, overextending, over-explaining, overcompensating, while quietly erasing parts of themselves just to keep a connection intact. until the fracture begins. A comment that cuts too deep. A silence that lasts too long. A moment where she looks in the mirror and cannot remember who she used to be. It doesn't happen all at once. The unraveling is slow. She begins to notice how little she asks for, and how even that is treated like a burden. She begins to see how often she swallows her needs to avoid rocking the boat. She begins to feel the exhaustion, not physical, but emotional. A soul tiredness that comes from being present for everyone but herself. And that is where the split begins. The persona she wore, the smiling, accommodating, ever-available version of herself, begins to feel like a costume. Heavy, tight, unbearable. But removing it feels dangerous, because the world has grown used to that version. And sometimes, so has she. So she stays. A little longer. She smiles through the comments. She hosts the gatherings. She says yes when everything in her whispers no. Until one day, the whisper becomes a roar, and she can't do it anymore. This is not a rebellion. It's a reckoning. Because every time she said yes to what hurt, she was saying no to herself. And now the inner voice she tried to quiet will no longer be silenced. It begins to ask difficult questions. Why do you only feel loved when you're needed? Why do you fear being alone more than you fear being disrespected? Why do you give so much when no one meets you halfway? These questions don't break her. They open her. But they also mark the end of an era. The era of chasing love through performance. The era of mistaking sacrifice for connection. The era of confusing pain with purpose. This is the fracture, not just with others, but within. Because to admit the truth would mean facing what she's denied. That love as she knew it was never safe. That approval was conditional. That too often her silence was mistaken for consent. Carl Jung taught that the shadow holds everything we reject or suppress, not just rage or jealousy, but our needs, our voice, our right to say no. And for many women, the early years are spent hiding these things. They become experts at being easy to love, but in doing so, they disappear. So the fracture comes as grace disguised as grief. It hurts deeply to realize how long she's gone unseen, how long she's gone unheard, even in rooms where she smiled the brightest. And yet this grief is sacred. It's the signal that she's finally ready to stop performing. Because the woman who once begged for scraps is slowly beginning to hunger for truth. And truth doesn't come through applause. It comes through stillness. In that stillness, she sees every pattern she once called fate. The overgiving, the people-pleasing, the silent suffering. And she begins to understand these were not random. They were inherited, modeled, rewarded. But now, the reward is hollow. What once felt noble now feels numbing. What once looked like strength now feels like self-abandonment. And what once seemed romantic now feels like erasure. This is the moment she stops chasing. Not just partners, but validation. Not just affection, but identity. She is not who she pretended to be. And the cracks in her performance are not failures, they are light. Because when the persona breaks, the self can begin. Jung believed the path to wholeness begins not with perfection, but with contradiction. And here in this quiet undoing, she finally allows both to exist, the part of her that wanted to be chosen, and the part of her that no longer wants to be defined by anyone else's choice. She begins to mourn not just past relationships, but the loss of her old self, the girl who stayed too long, the woman who kept quiet, the version of her that tried so hard to be enough for others that she forgot to be enough for herself. It is not bitterness she feels, it is clarity, and clarity often comes with pain. But this time, the pain is not a warning. It's a sign that something real is breaking through. A new voice is forming, not one that pleads, but one that declares. Not one that shrinks, but one that rises. This is not yet freedom, but it is the first step toward it. Because once the fracture has occurred, she can no longer go back to pretending. The mask is too tight, the role too small, and even if the world asks her to return to who she was, she knows she cannot. Something has shifted, and from here on, everything she allows must pass through a new filter. Does this honor who I'm becoming? Not just who she was in survival, but who she is in truth. And so begins the real journey. Not toward a new relationship, but toward a new relationship with herself, where love is no longer bought through sacrifice, where presence is no longer bartered for peace, where her worth is no longer on trial in someone else's eyes. She has not found peace yet, but she has found the lie. And the moment you stop believing the lie that your value comes from being needed, you begin to wake up. This is the fracture that opens the soul, not a break to fear, but a break that sets everything in motion. Because after this, her steps will never be the same. She may still stumble. She may still long, but she will never again betray herself for belonging. And that quietly is the beginning of power. When the fracture appears, something deeper begins to stir. What once seemed like a harmless habit, giving too much asking too little, now reveals itself as a mask. The persona, a carefully built role designed to keep her accepted, admired, and safe. She has been praised for her patience, her loyalty, her ability to endure. But that praise has been costly, because beneath it lies a woman who no longer recognizes her own reflection. Carl Jung described the persona as the mask we wear to meet the world, the polished surface that conceals what feels too raw to reveal. And while the mask is necessary, it can never be the whole truth. Here lies the conflict. The mask smiles, agrees, adapts. But the self beneath it grows restless, resentful, even weary. She can feel the gap between who she appears to be and who she really is. This gap is the birthplace of her shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not shameful. It is simply the unlived life, the hidden desires, the silenced voice, the untended grief. And once ignored long enough, it demands to be seen. At first, it shows up as fatigue, the sense that no matter what she gives, it is never enough. Then it appears as quiet anger, irritation at being overlooked, guilt for wanting more, shame for daring to speak her truth. The more she resists it, the stronger it becomes. Because what we resist does not disappear. It waits. It hides in our habits, in our choices, in our repeated relationships. Jung observed that what is not made conscious returns again as fate. So she finds herself circling familiar patterns. The same kind of partner, the same kind of dismissal, the same feeling of invisibility, no matter how brightly she shines. And she begins to wonder, is this destiny? Or is this simply a mirror of what I've refused to face in myself? The shadow often reveals itself in projections. She notices how certain women trigger her, the outspoken, the unapologetic, the ones who seem to take up space without hesitation. She calls them arrogant, selfish, cold. But if she looks closer, she sees her own denied qualities reflected back. The boldness she suppresses, the boundaries she avoids, the self-assurance she longs for but fears to embody. This is the paradox. What she judges in others may be what she most needs to awaken in herself. So long as she hides behind her persona, she will continue to repeat these patterns. Outwardly agreeable, inwardly unsettled. Outwardly stable, inwardly aching. The world applauds the persona. It keeps relationships smooth, workplaces pleasant, families intact. But inside, she feels a quiet betrayal. A life lived only in halves. The cost of the fuck is authenticity, and the cost of authenticity is risk. To reveal her real self means upsetting the balance she has so carefully kept. It means some may leave, some may misunderstand, some may even call her selfish. Yet the longer she hides, the heavier the mask becomes. You can feel it when you've worn one too long. The exhaustion of pretending. The quiet grief of betraying your own essence just to be acceptable. This is why Jung insisted that individuation, the journey to wholeness, requires us to meet the shadow, not to destroy it, but to integrate it. Because the shadow holds what the persona cannot. Her buried rage, her silenced needs, her wildness, her longing for reciprocity. It also holds her creativity, her freedom, her courage. Everything she has denied for the sake of being pleasing gathers there waiting. And until she turns toward it, the shadow will keep speaking in symptoms, anxiety, restlessness, failed connections, repeating disappointments. The shadow does not lie. It does not flatter. It simply waits for her to be ready. And eventually she is. Not all at once, but slowly. She begins to question the scripts she has followed for so long. She begins to admit the anger she once swallowed. She begins to notice how often she apologizes for existing. Each awareness is small, but each is revolutionary. Because every time she admits a hidden truth, the shadow loses some of its power. And every time she denies it, the shadow grows stronger. There is danger here too. For some, the shadow erupts suddenly in bitterness, in harsh words, in choices that shock even themselves. This is the backlash of decades of suppression. But if she can pause, breathe, and listen, she will see that the shadow is not here to destroy her. It is here to complete her, to remind her that wholeness does not come from perfection, but from inclusion. That she is not just the soft smile, but also the firm no. Not just the caregiver, but also the one who needs care. Not just light, but also shadow. This realization is terrifying, but also liberating. Because once she sees the mask for what it is, she can no longer confuse it with her true self. The role she played to be loved is not her essence. The silence she kept to feel safe is not her voice. The exhaustion she carried as normal is not her destiny. And now, she stands at a threshold. On one side, the persona familiar applauded, but suffocating. On the other, the shadow unsettling, unpredictable, but honest. The world may prefer the persona, but her soul will not survive there. So she begins the slow, courageous work of integration, of inviting the shadow into consciousness, of listening to what her anger says about her needs, what her envy says about her desires, what her fear says about her boundaries. This is not easy. It is not graceful. It is not simple, but it is real. And with each step, she feels the energy shift. Less performance, more presence. Less fear, more truth. Carl Jung once said, "I would rather be whole than good." This is the crossroads she now faces. To continue being good in the eyes of others, or to become whole in the truth of herself. The cost of one is approval. The cost of the other is authenticity. And in choosing authenticity, she begins to reclaim the life she thought she had lost. The persona kept her safe. But the shadow is what will make her real. And once she begins to see both clearly, her journey will never again be about pleasing the world. It will be about uniting the pieces she once scattered. This is the work of the soul. And this is where the awakening begins to rise. Awakening does not arrive with trumpets or fireworks. It comes quietly, often after long silence, like the slow light of dawn slipping across a darkened room. For a woman who has lived too long inside her mask, awakening begins the moment she realizes she no longer needs to carry both light and shadow as enemies. They can belong to the same sky. At first, she resists. She fears that if she drops the persona, she will lose everything: approval, belonging, even love. Yet the deeper truth presses through. What she risks losing is only what was never truly hers. Carl Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Awakening begins not in denying the shadow, but in facing it, and realizing it holds her keys to freedom. So, she pauses. She listens. She dares to sit with what she once avoided: her anger, her grief, her loneliness, her longing. And slowly, she learns that none of these will destroy her. They were only asking to be seen. This recognition changes everything. The very feelings she once feared now become teachers. Anger shows her where boundaries are needed. Grief shows her where love was misused. Loneliness shows her the depth of her own soul. Longing shows her the shape of her hidden desires. What once seemed like weakness begins to feel like wisdom. And in this space, she begins to see herself differently. She is not the smiling surface alone. She is not the silent sacrifice. She is both tenderness and fire, silence and voice storm and stillness. This is the essence of awakening, the integration of opposites. The realization that to be whole is not to be perfect, but to embrace what was denied. With each acceptance, the weight of the mask lessens. She breathes more deeply. Her eyes grow clearer. She no longer feels the need to perform in every room she enters. She begins to live from presence rather than from pretense. This shift unsettles those around her. Some who relied on her compliance begin to call her distant. Some who benefited from her silence accuse her of arrogance. The world often resists those who grow beyond its expectations, but within she feels a different current rising steady, quiet, unshakable. It is not pride. It is not rebellion. It is recognition. She is starting to remember her essence, the soul beneath all the costumes. And with that memory comes a new standard. She no longer craves to be chosen at any cost. She longs instead to be met as an equal, as a whole person, as someone who does not need to shrink to be loved. This clarity does not make life easier. In fact, it brings challenge, because now she cannot unsee what she has seen. She cannot go back to mistaking attention for affection or promises for presence. She has crossed an invisible threshold, and on the other side, love must look different. It must be free of domination, free of manipulation, free of the bargain where one soul disappears to keep the other comfortable. This is where many falter, because the new standard requires solitude until it is met. It requires saying no when once she would have said yes. It requires walking away from what does not honor her essence. And yet this is her awakening to realize that waiting is not emptiness, but loyalty to herself. Jung spoke often of the archetypes that live within us. In this awakening, one such figure stirs the wild woman. She is not wild in recklessness, but in truth. She refuses to be domesticated by convention, refuses to apologize for her intuition, refuses to barter her depth for acceptance. When she appears, the woman feels both frightened and alive. Frightened because this force does not obey the old rules. Alive because for the first time she senses that she is walking in her own skin. Awakening is rarely glamorous. It is nights of silence, days of clarity, and long stretches of being misunderstood. It is the courage to endure disapproval while holding on to the deeper knowing that this path leads to freedom. And freedom is not the absence of relationship. It is the absence of self-betrayal. She may still long for love. She may still ache for connection. But now she knows it must not come at the cost of her soul. This is the heart of the awakening. To know she is already whole. That nothing external can complete her. That what she seeks in another must already be found within herself, or else it will only echo the old wound. As this truth deepens, her very presence shifts. She speaks less, but with more weight. She gives less, but with more intention. She demands nothing yet. Her standards radiate clearly. People feel it, though they cannot always explain it. Some admire her strength. Others fear it. But she is no longer living for either reaction, because awakening has taught her something essential. Peace is not given. It is chosen, built, and defended in the soul. The woman who has walked through her fracture, met her shadow, and released her mask is not fragile. She is not desperate. She is not unfinished. She is awakening to herself. And from here forward, her life will not be measured by how much she is needed, but by how deeply she remains true. This is the moment when individuation ceases to be an abstract word and becomes lived reality. It is no longer theory. It is breath, blood decision. She has entered the territory where the soul no longer asks for permission to exist. And once you have entered this place, you cannot return to who you were. The awakening cannot be undone. It may be tested. It may be doubted. It may even be hidden at times when the world feels too heavy. But it remains like an ember that never dies, glowing beneath the surface, ready to light the path again. Awakening is not arrival. It is invitation. An invitation to live differently, to love differently, to choose differently, to stand without apology, even in silence. And for the woman who answers this invitation, life will never again be a stage where she performs to be seen. It will become a sanctuary where she lives to be real. Awakening may begin in silence, but transformation requires choice. Awareness alone cannot change a life. It must be lived out in action, in standards set in boundaries, drawn in the quiet decisions that say, I am loyal to myself. This is the moment where everything that was once understood in thought begins to take shape in behavior. It is not easy because the old patterns still whisper. The temptation to return to what is familiar, even when it hurts, is strong. Yet something inside has shifted. She no longer mistakes longing for love, nor compromise for care. And so, when the familiar voice returns, the one that says, be softer, be smaller, be silent, she pauses, and she chooses differently. The first boundary is often the most painful. It may be the refusal to accept crumbs of attention when she once celebrated scraps. It may be the decision to say no when her old self would have yielded. It may be the quiet turning away from those who cannot meet her depth. To the outside world, these actions may look harsh, but they are not cruelty. They are clarity. Carl Jung wrote that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. In the same way, the greatest burden a woman must bear is the unlived life of her own soul, and she is no longer willing to carry that weight. So, she begins to act. She declines the invitations that drain her. She withdraws from conversations that belittle her. She no longer explains her boundaries with long defenses. She lets her silence her absence, and her choices speak for her. This is not rebellion. It is alignment. Because the woman who once betrayed herself to be accepted now understands that every betrayal left a scar on her spirit, and she will not gather new scars for the comfort of others. At first, she trembles. She wonders if she is being too strict, too demanding, too cold. But with each boundary honored, she feels a new steadiness, a new loyalty, a new self-respect that no one else can give her. The transformation deepens when she realizes that boundaries are not walls to keep the world out. They are gates through which only truth can enter. The ones who cannot pass through those gates may call her distant, arrogant, or unloving. But the ones who do pass through will see her clearly for the first time. This is how discernment is born. She no longer entertains the idea of saving others with her sacrifice. She has learned that she is not responsible for healing what others refuse to face. Her responsibility is to guard the integrity of her own soul. The choice becomes clear. Either return to old scripts of need and approval, or step into a life where love is not begged for, but invited through reciprocity. This is where many falter, because waiting in such integrity feels lonely. But this loneliness is not emptiness. It is space, sacred space, where the soul expands and where the new can finally arrive. And so, she chooses the harder road. When she says no, she does not waver. When she steps back, she does not apologize. When she stands alone, she does not see it as failure, but as fidelity to herself. This fidelity is transformative. It changes her presence. She no longer explains her worth. She embodies it. She no longer asks, "Do you see me?" She becomes the kind of woman whose very presence cannot be ignored. Carl Jung taught that individuation is the process by which a person becomes what they truly are. In her choices, she is living this process. She is no longer half of anything. She is whole, and wholeness has its consequences. It unsettles those who prefer dependency. It offends those who thrive on control. It confuses those who expect her to dim in order to make them shine. But for her, the cost is worth it, because every no she speaks is also a yes to her peace, her clarity, her essence. Every boundary is an act of devotion, not against the world, but for her soul. Transformation is not dramatic. It does not need grand gestures. It happens in these simple moments, closing the door softly, choosing silence over argument, walking away without bitterness. Each choice is a thread, and slowly, these threads weave a new fabric for her life. A fabric of authenticity, dignity, and strength. This fabric cannot be torn by rejection. It cannot be worn thin by neglect. It is sustained by something deeper, the knowledge that she has chosen truth over illusion. The woman who once begged to be loved now knows she can love herself enough to wait. And this waiting is not passive. It is active loyalty. Loyalty to her awakening, to her healing, to her wholeness. She no longer looks outward for completion. She looks inward for alignment. And as she lives this way, something profound happens. She discovers that the right kind of love does not demand the sacrifice of self. It arrives quietly drawn, not by need, but by resonance. This is the paradox of transformation. The less she chases, the more she attracts what is true. The more she stands firm, the more others rise to meet her. The more she remains loyal to her essence, the more life reflects that essence back to her. This is why her boundaries are not cages, but bridges. Bridges to a future where love and freedom can coexist. And though the world may still judge her too strong, too independent, too difficult, she knows now that these judgments are not hers to carry. They are projections born from those who fear what she has found, because she has found what cannot be taken away: clarity. And clarity, once tasted, cannot be surrendered. So, she continues, step by step, choice by choice, weaving a life that honors her soul. Not waiting for applause, not waiting for approval, not waiting to be chosen, because she has already chosen herself. And that choice is the foundation of all that will follow. Every journey must reach a place of rest, not an ending, but a moment where the soul pauses to gather what has been learned. For the woman who walked through fracture, shadow, awakening, and boundary, this rest arrives as clarity. She is no longer asking the same questions she once did. She no longer wonders if her worth depends on being chosen. She no longer fears solitude as punishment. Now she knows. She knows that being alone does not mean being unloved. It means being whole enough to stand without apology. She knows that silence is not emptiness, but sanctuary. She knows that love is not measured by sacrifice, but by truth. This is the essence of individuation, the becoming of oneself. Jung taught that a tree that rises toward the heavens must also grow roots deep into the earth. She has done this work. She descended into her depths, faced what was hidden, and returned with wisdom. Her transformation does not make her untouchable. It makes her real. She still longs, she still feels, she still hopes. But now, longing does not rule her. Hope does not blind her. She can want connection without abandoning herself to get it. This balance is rare, and it is what unsettles the world. Because a woman who has learned to be whole is no longer governed by need. She does not chase, she does not beg, she does not shrink. She remains steady even when misunderstood. The lesson is not about rejecting love. It is about recognizing that love must add, not erase. That the right bond does not complete you, it joins you. That true presence is never begged for, only given freely. And in this, she becomes both mirror and guide. A mirror to those still hiding behind masks, showing them what is possible. A guide to those ready to step beyond old patterns, reminding them that wholeness begins within. For some, her clarity awakens admiration. For others, it provokes fear. Both are natural. Because when you choose authenticity over convention, you inevitably challenge the illusions others cling to. Yet she does not live to confront. She simply lives. And her presence alone carries the quiet weight of freedom. We often imagine transformation as grand, but its true power lies in the ordinary. It shows itself in the gentle refusal to enter conversations that diminish, in the soft closing of doors that once led to betrayal, in the way she can walk away without anger because peace is more valuable than victory. She is not above love. She is simply beyond distortion. She longs for connection, but only where she can remain whole. She dreams of union, but only with someone who has also met themselves in the mirror of their own soul. This is why her story matters, because it is not hers alone. It is the story of anyone who has faced the fracture between who they were told to be and who they truly are. It is the story of every soul who has dared to integrate shadow and light. Jung often reminded us that what we do not face within, we project onto others. By facing herself, she has freed others from carrying her unspoken wounds. By choosing boundaries, she has broken cycles that might have repeated for generations. By becoming whole, she has become a presence that no longer wounds but heals. The closure of her journey is not the absence of challenge. Life will still test her. Old voices will still call her back to smaller roles. But now she carries something that cannot be shaken: clarity. And clarity is its own protection. So what can we take from this reflection? That solitude is not failure. It is loyalty to the soul. That boundaries are not rejection. They are devotion to what is true. That wholeness is not perfection. It is the courage to live with both shadow and light without denying either. And perhaps most importantly, that love the kind worth waiting for cannot be built on fear or emptiness. It must be born from two whole souls who choose to walk side by side, not to complete, but to celebrate. This is the lesson that closes her path, and it is also the invitation for ours. To pause, to ask, where have I betrayed myself to be loved? Where have I mistaken noise for presence? Where have I hidden behind a mask that no longer fits? If you find yourself in those questions, know this: you are not broken. You are being called inward. You are being asked to listen for the truth of your own soul, because the world may try to tell you that you are missing something. But the deeper truth is that everything you need to begin again is already within you. Jung once wrote that those who look outside dream, but those who look inside awaken. The final step of this journey is to trust that awakening, even if it leads you into silence, because in that silence, you will discover the presence you thought was missing your own. So, let us close here, not with urgency, but with peace. Let this reflection be a reminder that you are already enough. That solitude can be sacred. That wholeness is possible. And if these words have stirred something in you, share it below. Tell me where you are listening from, or what part of this journey spoke most to your heart. Because when we share our reflections, we remind each other that none of us walks alone.